Now a response from Dr. Dale Brock. He is Research Professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary.
Well, I want to begin the rebuttal by agreeing with Dr. Borg about something, and that is that the issue is, in my judgment, a paradigm difference, but I want to disagree with the way he wants to handle it and also from the response from Dr. Schmidt. I think we have to distinguish between what a person believes and what they think they can show about what they believe, and I think tonight is about the second and not the first. We are attempting to argue that a strong and solid case for historicity exists for the basic elements of the crucifixion-resurrection account, and that this approach is far more plausible than the claim that the language is metaphorical or poetry plus, or that the historicity of these events does not matter. So what I am arguing for here is something I believe we can show is going on. I also want to start off by talking about the nature of Scripture and the claim that traditions about Jesus grow and develop as they are written to address different audiences. And I will note that the early audiences were Jewish and the subsequent audiences were primarily Greek, and that there are two voices in the material, the voices of Jesus on the one hand and of early Christian communities that are reflected in those texts. I think that description is broad in its truth, and there is a wide variety and great diversity in how that mechanism is seen, and that's why we had the earlier exchange about the nature of authorities. But what I'm arguing here is that the seed of this tradition, where it starts its growth, comes from a historical starting point, not a metaphorical starting point. And that contrast is purposeful because the seed is historical, and then the explanation develops around that seed, which is historical, and that seed developed in a Jewish context. And that brings me to my next point. You see, one thing that hasn't been said yet tonight is that in Judaism, there was not a belief previous to Jesus' resurrection that an individual would be resurrected in history and in time apart from a belief in a generalized resurrection for all at the end of time. That's unique. There is no Jewish text that we have that creates the metaphor of the mere poetry plus approach on a historical ground that we know of. Now, resurrection was not the general term for life after death. There were various approaches to resurrection. There was the option of immortality of the soul. This is mentioned by Philo in On Abraham 2:58. It's mentioned in Josephus in his Jewish War 3:372. When he talks about the immortality of the souls, and he says he's talking like a philosopher. It's mentioned in 2 Maccabees as well. We also have the picture of bodily resurrection. Bodily resurrection is noted in the metaphor of Ezekiel 37, the teaching of Daniel 12:2, and texts like 2 Maccabees 7, 9, 11, 22, 23, 29. I want to mention these historical texts because it's important that when we construct metaphors and worldviews, we understand the context in which they were constructed. Let me repeat again. There is in Judaism no view that one person would receive the resurrection while the rest of history continued unchecked. And never is the word resurrection used in Judaism for something essentially non-concrete, which gets to the nature of the body question. Let me say it another way. There is a very graphic passage in 2 Maccabees in which a fellow named Razes, dying, stabbed, pulls out his entrails, okay, and then the text goes on to talk about the motivation for doing it was because he longed for the day when God would restore him back to life, if you will, entrails and all. That's a very physical picture of resurrection. So my point here, my first point is that the seed from which any explanatory poetry would come from, out of Judaism, does not exist for the uniqueness of what Jesus is proclaimed to have done. So if we would have had a created story, we would not have created the kind of story we get in the resurrection accounts. If we would not have created the kind of story that we have in the resurrection accounts, then the question begs to be answered, where did it come from? It came from some event, apparently, that moved the disciples to create, in effect, a new theological category from which to view not only the life and ministry of Jesus, but also their own lives and their own process and journey. So that the message of the resurrection is not merely that Jesus is with us and is journeying along with us through time. The message of the resurrection then becomes that Jesus is a rather unique figure on the scene of history. And the effect of that was not just that people moved themselves, and now I'm shifting here, I'm shifting my attention to the idea of theology or poetry plus. And what I want to say about that is, theology is about poetry plus. It's about poetry plus history. It's about poetry alongside the seed that explains it. And that history is important to generating the nature of the poetry that we see in the resurrection accounts. And so what we get is not a Christianity that emphasizes that we are to ally ourselves to some type of ideology or ethic that says no in a vindication, in Jesus' vindication, to some type of domination system, although there are elements of that to Jesus' teaching. That's not the primary emphasis. What we get as a result of resurrection is not ideology, not ethic, but worship. Where does that come from, if the metaphorical view is correct? Let me wrap up. I could say much more, but I think those 2 points say a lot. Let me wrap up by saying it this way. The affirmation of how Jesus lives and how he is Lord is variously defined by the two sides. In my mind, it is not entirely clear how Jesus functions as living and as Lord, other than as some kind of indictment, as an authoritative prophetic example, calling me to reject the domination system. That's what I'm hearing in summary from Dr. Borg. So it leads me to the question, how does Jesus actually function as Lord? What does he do? What is the content of that affirmation theologically? I'm not talking here about historically, I'm talking about the theological content of that affirmation. And why does it lead to worship? On the other hand, I think what Bill and I are saying, what Dr. Craig and I are saying, is that the emphasis is on allegiance to him. As a person, as a raised person. And I would say about the idea that the corpse is irrelevant and whether we could photograph it, I think I would say, bring your cameras. The tomb is empty. That's the declaration. More than that, I would say that however we interpret the metaphor of the doubting Thomas, what's behind the metaphor is, touch this. It's the opposite of the old Hammer rap song, can't touch this. Now, please, the point is not to be funny. The point is that these metaphors in these texts are communicating something very concrete about what took place that transformed a former persecutor like Paul into someone who followed Jesus. I guarantee you, if there had been a corpse in a tomb or a body that could have been produced, that the persecutor Saul would have never become the apostle Paul. And that's another important point in this discussion. So what we are saying is this: our emphasis is on an allegiance that is connected to him because of a unique set of vindicating events. I agree that God has vindicated Jesus. That's the point of the resurrection. That's how I can see his claims that I otherwise could not prove. They are a step on the way to leading me to faith. And as a result, we have an accountability to Him as His creatures, and we worship Him as Christians, and we sing to Him, and we sing to Him not merely to His cause or merely to His ethic.